I'm Marisa Benjamin. I'm the Research Communications Officer here at the Games Institute. And for those of you who don't know or who need some refreshing, the Games Institute is a multidisciplinary research center at the University of Waterloo. We're one of the faculty-wide research centers here, but our niche is in games and interactive technologies. So these panels are really, really special because it's our opportunity to sort of show you what that means, what it means to be A, multidisciplinary, B, interested in games, and C, interested in interactive technologies. These panels, we bring together different game scholars and we ask them to think about a specific game. So today, we're going with the horror game Five Nights at Freddy's. I wanted to do a horror game because it's Halloween, and also we have one of the, I would say, world experts on Five Nights at Freddy's.
Nobody else wanted the title.
So I will also read a little bit about Five Nights at Freddy's, but know that I am not the expert at all. I wrote this myself, and I really, really do hope that the more we chew into this topic, the more you understand better than this little thing I prepared. Five Nights at Freddy's is a popular indie game series that has you playing as a night security guard in a pizzeria called Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria, which is spelled with an A, pizzeria. Important detail. You are tasked with monitoring the many creepy animatronics that occupy the pizzeria, and you have to make sure they don't get up to anything they shouldn't at night. There are about 6 versions of the game and some VR and AR versions as well. In each iteration, though, you are tasked with having to survive at least 5 nights without getting attacked by one of those creepy animatronics. The story behind Five Nights at Freddy's is rich and complicated. The way the game reveals that story is rich and complicated. The game mechanics and design are rich and complicated. The fan engagement is rich and complicated. Expression of horror is rich and complicated. Anyway, for all those reasons, we've chosen to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's here. Today, we're talking about it today on Halloween, the best day of the year. We don't have any visuals today with which we intend to scare you. That being said, the content we're discussing includes stories about a serial killer, death of children, zombies, and hauntings. We'll be talking about these things in terms of how they relate to Five Nights at Freddy's and about how they contributed to our fearful experiences of the game. So that is a warning that we hope that you do take seriously because we will get into all of that stuff. And now, I'm almost done doing my monologue part, I promise, but I want to read a bio of our speakers so that you know who we have up here. Starting with Pamela. Pamela Maria Schmidt completed her BA in Honors, Rhetoric and Literature, with a Russian and Eastern European minor, and a digital media specialization from the University of Waterloo. She's currently an English master's student in experimental digital media, and her plethora of interests include haunting literary theory, pop culture studies, critical media discourse, and storytelling. So I've asked her to be up here today wearing her experimental digital media hat, but especially her Slavic studies hat. Betsy is a PhD candidate in the Department of English Language and Literature. Her research focuses on the intersections of narratological structure and gameplay. In particular, she's interested in how players understand and interpret narrative forms in role-playing games and metagames. Her work is inspired by intersectional feminism, knowledge mobilization, and accessible scholarship. She's also editor-in-chief for First Person Scholar, which is housed here at the Games Institute. Her research and projects have been supported through the REFIT grant, the Immerse Research Network, and a MyTax partnership, and the Games Institute. And her writing has been featured in many, many places. And later we'll talk about how you can find both of them on Twitter. But that is who you have sitting here. Betsy will be wearing her game studies and narrative studies hat. Pamela, as I said, is sitting here with her Slavic studies hat. And now that that is all out of the way, I'm going to open with a question. So I want you both to talk about your experience of the game. How did you first come to start playing it for the first time? What has it been like since then? What do you find interesting about it? And then also if you can weave all of that together into what you and your unique disciplinary perspective brings to the study of this particular game. Betsy goes first.
Well, all right. I ended up studying Five Nights at Freddy's, and I always joke before I give presentations that any compliments about my research should go to me, of course, but any complaints should go to Marcelo Garman in the English department because he's the one who did this to me. While I was studying for my comprehensive doctoral exams, I needed object text to look through game studies with. So to apply theory to a game, you need a game. And I talked to Marcel, who was one of my supervisors for the exam. And we chatted through and had a couple of good ideas and things like that. At the time, it was right after Five Nights at Freddy's, the first one, had come out, and he expressed frustration that his children were playing this loud, screechy game on his iPad all the time. And he told me the name, and I was like, oh, okay. When it came to having to request games as an object for my exams, I thought I'd be funny because I have a habit of antagonizing people who have power over me. Thought it'd be funny to put Five Nights at Freddy's along with the 2 games that we had already discussed. And I was like, of course he's going to pick the thing that we talked about. But, hubris and whatnot, he picked Five Nights at Freddy's. So I spent, a year of my life studying, the most stressful year of my life, by the way, watching horror jump scares constantly and learning more and more about this series. It does still scare me sometimes. If anybody happened to see the live stream we did yesterday.
We apologize for the noise.
It got us pretty good. And there have been other occasions I've been playing it here, so everybody's probably heard me yelp very loudly in here before. So that was how I started studying it, but what ended up happening is, as I was looking at it just for my exams, I ended up finding lots of interesting bits and pieces, particularly the storytelling practices that are going on in these games. It's a lot more complicated than a traditional kind of narrative, and I was very interested in trying to frame how it is that it's telling its story. Then I found out on the internet, nobody knows what the story is really. And that's been developing over the years, and more games have come out, and more explanations, more guesses, I suppose. So it's just a big old mystery, and how can a narrative scholar who looks at games not be interested in that? So that's really what happened to me. And here we are. I presented at a couple conferences, and I have a book chapter coming out about the fan community and Five Nights at Freddy's pretty soon too. So it's been a wild, interesting road, and like I said, compliments go to me, complaints go to Marcel.
So my experience playing the game is terrible. I like horror games, but what gets me in this game in particular is the lack of agency and that you can't move. You're in a spot. You have no cover, no shield, nothing. Everything comes at you. You use something else will come out, and I hate that. And I really dislike it. But what kind of initially got me playing the game, like I've heard of it before vaguely in like the community, and I do like horror games. But I kind of avoided it, didn't have time. And then Marisa asked me to be on this panel, so I was voluntold to play this game. But then I really got into it, and I binged lore videos on it. Game Theory on YouTube has 32 episodes of just trying to dissect the lore, and they still don't have it because it's that complicated, just to put that into perspective for everyone. But I think what, kind of same with Betsy, like I was just really gravitating towards the narrative and its complexity and its vagueness. And even though I wear kind of an English scholar hat, my Slavic hat is always underneath there. Since it is a culture study, it is a literature study, and in particular Slavic literature is very vague, very horror-driven, very macabre because of historical situations. So I really gravitate towards those kinds of revenge narratives or lack of agency and haunting and whatnot. So.
Thank you both. Okay, so now that we've done all of the prefacing and talked about how they got into it, for the rest of the panel I'm going to go into more specific questions that open up other discussions. And then there is an opportunity near the end to have an open conversation question period with you. And if you feel like you know something and you want to bring it up, that's an awesome time to do it too. I have with me a couple of questions that I prepared. I asked via Twitter and Instagram, grabbed them there. So we'll weave that into the previous discussion. But yes, please do think about questions you'd like to ask for later. So you both, in your telling of this, talked about how the story was so important to the reasons why you got ripped and dragged into it. So what is the story of the game? And talk about it in terms of how we end up discovering the story, and what is so special about the way that narrative gets delivered to the players in comparison comparison to maybe some more traditional narrative-driven games?
So I mentioned this briefly again, but kind of the vagueness of it. You don't really know what you're there. You're given small clues during the game. So even for the second one of the opening screens, it's like, old Freddy's burned down, you're at a new one. And it's like, why are you at a new one? And you have a check for like the first night you survived. It's like, what is my name? What am I doing? And you don't really know who you are. But kind of, I guess, where the largest structures of narrative come in the in-between moments. So when you beat a night, you kind of get these weird Atari, like, we're talking about OG Atari games, like the really bad 2-bit kind of movement ones, little specials, and those tell narratives, and you're in a creepy place, for example, where you have children crying, and then it's like, follow me, and you have to follow something, and you follow it too much, and then this purple guy comes out and kills you, and then you get a jump scare, and it's like, you're like, what is this? This isn't even part of the main gameplay, but then that kind of drags you into, okay, who are these children? Why is this guy in purple murdering me? And then he's not even in the main gameplay, so what does that mean? And so I guess that vagueness is really what, especially narrative and English scholars were like, what does that even mean, bro? And as you keep playing, you kind of get more clues, and it doesn't quite piece together. And then the next game comes out, and it's like, okay, but who is the crying child? Why are these children dead? Why is this one thing there's a sequence where you have this puppet, and it's like, give gifts, and you see dead children, and you give them gifts individually, and they receive a mask, and each mask is the animatronic, or one of the animatronics. So it's like, okay, are these animatronics then possessed with the spirits of murdered children that were murdered by this purple guy before? And then it starts clicking, and you just want to discover more, and I think that's what really kind of drives this fandom, is the vagueness and trying to uncover what that vagueness means and why is it so trenched in trauma.
Yeah, I second that very, very much. You only get the story in little bits and pieces, and quite often it's in sometimes those little mini games. I think the third game is where they start having the mini games in between nights. In the second game, they appear at once every maybe 10 times you die.
Yeah.
So you have to die, and then this weird little Atari game pops up, and they're incredibly vague, and you get killed. You play as one of the animatronics in all of these little mini games, and end up getting dismantled in all of these little mini games. The first game doesn't have any of those, however, and what I think is interesting about that is you have there's a voice over a phone system telling you, like, welcome here, sorry I can't help you out and answer any questions, just don't let them touch you, and that's basically all you work with. But while you're looking through a series of cameras to see where these animatronics are in the facility, the walls will actually change a little bit. You'll find different newspaper clippings on the wall, and they'll say things like 5 children missing, no suspects, or bits and pieces like that, I guess. You'll see newspaper clippings, you'll see different children's drawings appear, and it's like you put the camera up in a room and it has one picture, you set it down and it has a different one. So those are consistently changing, and in the middle of a very tense environment, I think like the tense dread of the situation also makes it more interesting, because you're just like, wait, what? I need something stable, and nothing is. I think one of the more interesting pieces that kind of created this dialogue of missing children being possessing these suits is at one point there's a newspaper clipping saying a previous pizzeria had been closed down because the suits were leaking blood out of the eyes and smelled terrible. Yeah. And the security guard who works the day shift explains that if you're captured by one of the animatronics, they will shove you inside one of the suits. So the kind of narrative implication there is that these children were shoved into these suits, and then all of a sudden, you have foul-smelling animatronics.
Yeah.
So there's little bits of very traditional casual logic. But then the main pieces, the motivators, a mystery novel's no good unless you know who did it at the end, right? You don't have that. You never get that. Instead, you just get more and more and more complexity stacking up throughout the, 5, 6, 7, 8 games, I think. I mean, there's a lot. So that's what I thought was very interesting about it.
But even so, like if you think about narrative structures, humans really like circular plots, right? So you get your cathartic ending. And with this, you don't have any catharsis. Like you're just in suffering, and it's like, what's going on? And even at one point, the voiceover guy, I think it's in the second one, is like, oh, at the old one, I think it was one of the security guys that was implicated. So then that's another piece of evidence that it's potentially one of the security personnel was behind the murder. So again, you're getting lots of pieces, it's vague, and you're never having like a, yes, it was a security man. For all we know, it could have been some random wacko. So.
Yeah.
Can you also talk a bit about, you use the term paranarrative in some of your research, Betsy. How does that apply here, and how does that help us actually make sense of why maybe the creators of these games are choosing this narrative structure?
So I come from an English studies background, so paranarrative is not to be confused with paratext. Those are two different things if you're familiar with paratext. Paranarrative uses the prefix para, which means about or around. So a paranarrative is a story that is seemingly related but not necessarily connected. A very famous example of a story with a paranarrative structure is the Odyssey. And yes, any of you can be mad at me for saying the Odyssey and Five Nights at Freddy's in the same sentence. But the story of Odysseus isn't told exactly through Odysseus' own narrative consistently. It's told through different pieces of different elements of contemporary media at the time. It's told through different stories and poems. It's told through other people's stories that are kind of adjacent but kind of not. So it has kind of a multi-stranded narrative where the story itself is told not through the main narrative functions, but through the ones around it, surrounding it. So what we have in Five Nights at Freddy's is the actual narrative of that game is I went through 5 miserable nights at this animatronics facility. It was very scary. Yay, I got a paycheck for $100 at the end. This is great. But the other story, the one that we're usually talking about, is actually a paranarrative. It's something that's going on around it that is hinted at or told in bits and pieces, but never directly as a narrative, part of that main narrative. And the example that I've used in previous talks, I want to say it's the 7th or 8th game. It depends. It's complicated. And Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator is the name of the game I'm talking about in particular. It's like a roller coaster tycoon-esque game where you create a pizzeria, and you create like a Chuck E. Cheese's or that's actually the only animatronics pizza place I can think of.
Chuck E. Cheese, right?
Chuck E. Cheese, yeah. It was a really popular combo for all of 10 seconds, and then people realized everyone's terrified of animatronics. But before that happened, anyway, sorry, back to that's a paranarrative, by the way, there in what I just did. That's my excuse. In Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, you might buy a particular item in your pizzeria, and then you go to play test it. If you win the game once, it's like a Pac-Man ripoff, basically. It's an arcade cabinet that's basically Pac-Man. And as you're playing it, the screen will flash as you get points, and you can see the player's reflection in the mirror, or in the black screen. And it's this little girl, and she's smiling, and it's very happy. And you play it again after you beat it, and it changes. She looks very sad, and some of like the items that you're picking up in this Pac-Man game, Pac-Man-like game, they have changed from fruits to things like wilted flowers, or there's like bloody footprints in the corner or something like that. And the music is sadder. You do it again, and the music is completely changed, entirely in its tempo. This little girl's reflection in the screen, she's just crushed. She's incredibly sad. And the items that you would be picking up in this Pac-Man-like game have transformed into like a dead dog. And as you're playing, none of the power-ups work, and it's very it's ruined. You can't possibly win it. There's no way to. The time's going to run out. It's impossible to beat it. At some point, a very loud car alarm goes off. That didn't happen before. And, you know, putting all of that together, you can kind of, like, maybe guess that this little girl is sad because her pet got hit by a car, right? You're seeing bits and pieces of this car accident happen in this game. But then when you run out of time that third time, the screen keeps flashing and you see her reflection, and an animatronic rabbit comes up behind her. And he says to her, like, don't be afraid, he's still alive, you don't need to be sad, he's over here, just follow me. And then it quits. So, I mean, what you're seeing is the luring and the implication of, in the murder of this child who's sad. And this is why we have trigger warnings on this talk, sorry. That narrative is something entirely optional, that little story set. You have to be able to beat one of the mini games 3 times to access it, and you have to be good enough at Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator to have enough money to buy the arcade cabinet in the first place. So it's varied between about 8 different levels of gameplay, and it's just one little facet of this larger story, and I think it's actually one of the more distinct facets because that one makes sense, and unfortunately. Other bits and pieces imply later that that little girl's name is Susie and that she became bonded to the Chica animatronic, the large chicken. Although people thought she was a duck at first. Anyways, so paranarrative, I think that's a really good example of it because it's a piece of story that is easily connected to this mainline story, but the main narrative, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Simulator, is like, I got $1,000, gonna open me one of those real lucrative pizzerias with scary animatronics. And you know, you have to keep your place clean, and you have to maintain it, and you have to make sure that you know, the kids don't hurt themselves, and you have to fight lawsuits if they do, and you know, you have to meet health and safety standards. So it's not even like related seemingly, but in connection with all the other games and the other elements of para-narrative, you begin to see these patterns, and you want to be able to place them into a linear timeline, but none of them actually have any markers of where they appear in a timeline, right? So it's incredibly complicated, but I think paranarrative as a structure makes a lot more sense because you can have simultaneous narrative structures running at the same time. That was a very long explanation. I apologize for that, Shell. But it's kind of an obscure term, and when I saw that in describing the Odyssey, I was like, oh my gosh, it's Five Nights at Freddy's. And I do think I will be punished by some classics department somewhere for making that comparison.
So as I was playing the game / not playing the game because I get too scared I'd immediately quit, I was talking to these two and trying to learn the narrative. I didn't want to put in the effort to do it myself. So I learned, like, you are actually playing as somebody specific. You're not just any random night security guard. Your name is Michael Afton. You are the son of a William Afton who was the engineer for these animatronics and who you actually discover was the killer of the children whose souls are bonded to the animatronics.
Probably.
So, yeah, the paranarrative is interesting and engaging, but it's a lot of work for one person to do on their own. And that leads me to wonder, I mean, especially when you talk about the Odyssey, that leads me to wonder how that relates to Slavic lore. Because, I mean, I've read what you wrote about Baba Yaga yesterday, who's a figure well known in Slavic studies. But I'm curious about, like, the way that stories in Slavic lore travel about figures and how they evolve and change and get picked up, and like how that ties together. Does any of this resonate with what you know?
I'm not sure with folklore in general, but maybe the use of folklore and kind of these hidden stories and manipulation of it kind of relates to Slavic studies. So in particular, in kind of the Romantic era in Slavic cultures, specifically those sandwiched in between Germany and Russia, you have supreme oppression happening from the Russian Empire, Germans, Habsburgs, Ottomans, all through that kind of middle ground. So we're talking like Poland, Ukraine, Czech, Croatia, Serbia, kind of all the way down to Bulgaria. And in English kind of romanticism for English people in the room, it's very much about individuality, kind of a return to nature, but for Slavic countries, it was literally a fight for individuality to not lose your culture. So suddenly you see a lot of kind of pagan narrative come back because it's like, what is more authentically us than our religion and culture? like original kind of stuff. So people would use figures like Baba Yaga as like, she originally was the goddess of water, life, and death. But suddenly you're seeing her in stories and becoming more of this like witch figure as opposed to a Slavic pagan god, right? So it's kind of, I guess, a loss of translation, but also trying to find something that was once there. To kind of answer your question in terms of that, how that fits in with Five Nights at Freddy's. But I guess kind of finding the stories and even these small kind of Atari games where you're getting little bits and pieces of what these children were and what they've become almost. Because one of the big things that you kind of learn throughout the games is that the reason why they continue to attack you is because you represent their killer, a guard who was watching the place, right? So assume you're male, notably your name is Michael, that never changes. For most of it. And so essentially you're a big male figure who has the same job position that murdered these children, right? So you kind of have this transplantation of role in that, but so I'm not quite sure what that kind of connection, but I can tell you that in terms of like, if we're looking at the kind of works that evolved from that Romantic period in Slavic countries, they're huge, like they were hugely driven with a lack of agency, a lack of political, religious, cultural agency. And that's kind of what I really feel in these games, is like these children had lack of agency in terms of their lure and eventual unfortunate passing aways. And you as the security guard also have lack of agency. You cannot move. You cannot resort to like closing all the doors and sitting there until the end of the night. You have to keep moving. You have to do this. You can't stand up. You can't run away. You can't fight back. You just have to stop them. And even like in the game, for example, the animatronics can crawl through vents. Really fun. And then it's like you see one and it's like in the vents through the cameras and you can flash it to make it stop. And then it comes closer and you see it in your office and you put on a mask so it like thinks you're it and it's passing by. But then you have this music box and another camera that you need to wind. So another one doesn't come. So it's like, crap, do I either get killed? Do I wait? Do I have enough time to actually wind this up? So this massive lack of agency is what kind of really resonated with me with playing the game and reminded me of those kind of like weird, horrific narratives that came out of this era of supreme oppression in Slavic countries. So I don't know if that actually answers your question, but
Yeah. And we can get more into, we should get back to lack of agency as well when we talk more about the horror of the game. But when you're talking that connected with a question that we received from somebody coming in via Twitter, this is from Tobin. Do you think that players' styles or approaches to the game changed when they were able to learn more about the character they were playing as? So as the revelation came out that you were playing as Michael Afton, because there's not a ton of freedom already in how you play, but is it possible that like the relationship to the character you were playing as would have changed when you learned that you were playing as the son of a serial child murderer?
before I give it to Betsy, because I think Betsy is the one to answer first, but it's really interesting that you mentioned that because, for example, in the third FNAF, when you play the crying, or is that the fourth, with the crying child, that was the fourth, yes. So you're playing presumably, although it has changed somewhat, but as Michael Afton as a child, in which you're in a room, a bedroom. It's argued whether this is a dream sequence or whether he was in a coma, trying to fend off monsters or the animatronics coming into your room. And through playing the Atari games, you find out that presumably Michael, again we're not sure, was bullied by his older brother who put him into one of the animatronic suits and cracked his skull. Hence the coma narrative, or is it his purgatory, so to speak. So that also changes your relationship with the character. It's like, I am the son of a serial killer, but I am also a victim, which comes out later, which at first when I found out I was potentially a child murderer, I was like, yeah, kill me, go for it. But later when I played this fourth game, and you're kind of such like circumstantial kind of victim in and of yourself, and later it comes out that potentially you're trying, as Michael, you're trying to shut down all these creations and like atone for your father's sins, and it gets really messy from there, so I'll let Betsy handle the messy part.
My favorite part, the messy part. Sorry. It's extra interesting too because you don't know anything about the character you're playing as in the first, I mean, all you know in the first game up until you get a paycheck if you beat it is that you are here in this place. There's no character symbolism. In a lot of first-person games, you often have hands represented or something like that, and usually they appear to be Caucasian man's hands is the typical, right? And they're usually, you've all seen these hands in first-person shooter games. Like we know these particular ones, but you don't even have that kind of identification. There's absolutely nothing. It's point and click with the mouse, and you never leave your character's focalized point of view, with the exception of if you lose, you see one of your eyes stuck in a Freddy Fazbear head. That's the only time it actually breaks first-person perspective, because obviously he couldn't be looking at his own eye. Anyways, I'm going to quit that line. And then you get that check, and it says Mike Schmidt. And the argument through the meta-narrative lore is that he said Schmidt because he knew he wouldn't get hired if he said Afghan. And there's a lot of debate about several things. But when we get to the fourth one, where particularly this crying child figure is appearing, the one being tortured by his older brother, some people are saying that the older brother is actually Michael.
Yeah, that's true.
And then Michael, gets his terrified little brother too close to an animatronic. This kid who you're playing as spends all of his time crying and trying to get out, but he keeps getting brought to Freddy Fazbear's, even though he obviously hates it. He cries the whole time. He says, "I can't be here."
Can't watch.
I can't watch. If he gets near an animatronic, he bursts into tears, and he says, "You can't go that way. You know what you saw." Yeah. So he's also seen some really traumatizing things. So a lot of people have connected this to, like, maybe their parents worked there, and that's why he had to be brought back constantly, even though he very clearly hated it. And then at the end of that game, his brother gets him too close to one of them, and there's that unfortunate accident. And there's a lot of, there's obviously a lot of sympathy there, especially when you're playing that fourth game. Occasionally, if you look behind you onto the bed in your bedroom, sometimes like a pot of flowers or an IV stand appears. But the rest of the time, it just looks like a normal children's bedroom, except for the fact that there's horrible monsters everywhere.
That kind of glitch and like.
Yeah, yes, it's pretty frightening. That one's my least favorite, by the way.
Mine too.
I think it's the scariest one. It makes the gameplay
I think
is
it's
different.
the moving.
That one lets you move a little bit, and also you have to listen a lot more in that one. And I think the sound is really what makes these games really terrifying. But yeah, I felt a lot of sympathy after I realized that I was just this little kid in the fourth one, in the third one, and the second one. I don't know who these people are. You're just some security guard, and maybe a murderer. I don't know. I mean, there's no indication of who you are. You look, yeah.
No, and usually when we play these kinds of games, we have a habit of kind of transplanting ourselves onto the characters we play, right? And that's sometimes where you get lots of fandom culture, or kind of these, for lack of a better term, these Mary Sue type figures, right? Where you are physically in kind of the space. But that becomes complicated when it's like, am I a murderer? Is that how I want to feel playing this game? Or am I a severely traumatized child, right? So it becomes really messy when you kind of playing this and transposing your own image onto it. And is it better to kind of take a step back and view it as like, okay, this is this man doing these things, or is this like me playing as this? So.
Thank you.
Okay, so all of this needs us to acknowledge the wonderful term from Betsy about these games called forensic fandom, which refers to fans doing research basically and working together to pull all of these pieces and then weave the narrative. But at the same time, that means that there has to be some sort of fandom cross-idea sharing and agreement on what then becomes the story, what they accept as canon. So that leads me into thinking, let's talk about forensic fandom and canon in relation to the adaptations as well. So I mean, we've already talked a lot about how forensic fandom functions in the franchise, because clearly, like, nobody can play these games and uncover everything if it takes 10 layers to get one piece of story. So I am curious about what you think about agreement across fans about what ends up being canon, and what you think about adaptation. So before I hand it over to you, I'm also going to read a question which comes in from Nick. The Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, while starting exclusively in horror games, has dived into many other mediums and genres that no other game franchise has. There are spin-offs turned based into RPGs, management sims, books, movies, merchandise, theme park attractions, and several AR and VR titles. So what about this game series makes it so adaptable to so many mediums and genres? And then layer that question in with what we talked about, canon and forensic fandom. I know you can do it.
Oh, okay. So I think a little bit of context helps with the forensic fandom term. It was originally coined when people were doing studies of TV shows, and particularly the show Lost, if folks remember that one. Another very confusing narrative that mostly involved, I mean, the narrative of Lost came to be because people came together and tried to figure out what it was. So forensic fandom often refers to practices by fans for digging for clues, acting as their own kind of researchers, and looking for narratological hints, basically, anything that can help produce meaning out of these pieces that are so intriguing. As that's gotten pulled forward and used in other, I mean, we've seen a lot more of these kinds of communities since Lost in 2000. Oh gosh, was that 2000? Don't know. It was a little while ago, but we've seen more and more of these kinds of communities come out, and I'm very interested in these meta storytelling communities in particular. But with Five Nights at Freddy's, it gets really complicated because Scott Cawthon, the sole creator and IP owner, also chimes in, and sometimes he lies. He will contradict himself. He will say, I didn't mean that. He'll say, I take that back. He wrote a series of incredibly poorly written novels.
Yeah.
I deserve a medal for reading them, okay? I mean, oh.
Did you read them?
Yes, I did. It was bad. It was very painful. Sorry, Scott, if you're watching this. Or if you found this to be enjoyable. What you like is what you like. I'm not going to shame that. It was awful for me. But first he said the books had nothing to do with the games.
Yeah.
Then he said they might. And then he wrote another book that said good fans will apply pieces of the books where it makes sense.
What does that even mean, bro?
What does that mean? So it's complicated enough. And then you have the person who decides what is and isn't canon coming in and complicating that. But even beyond that, like what people are trying to determine as canon, even if they completely ignore Scott Cawthon's shenanigans, is just what we see in the games. People trying to pull different pieces of evidence and saying this is canon, this is canon, this is canon. There's a lot of, if this is true, if A equals B and B equals C kind of stuff going on. Lots of what becomes canon is more or less just what you can see and make the most basic of logical connections to. For example, you receive a paycheck at the end of a game. It would make sense if it belonged to you, right? There's no indication it's yours. There's no you taking that. But it's a very basic connection to be like, okay, that is my paycheck for having completed my job for this week. So like that kind of thing becomes canon. People have tried to place things together, but the canon doesn't really exist. There's just the objects and trying to reorder them in a way that anybody can make sense of. And then,
And even the community argues.
yeah, the community, actually I think the first big argument the community had was whether or not Foxy was male or female. I'm not going to explain why that argument occurred. You can't have things on the internet, okay? Just, you can't. So, it went on from that though, and people at first were like, oh, obviously you're the killer. No, you're not the killer. You're this guy, Mike Schmidt. No, what about these things on the wall? And sometimes if you flip the camera this way twice, another animatronic that doesn't appear anywhere else will come up. And that one isn't like the other ones. That one, by the way, is called Golden Freddy, and in an interview, Scott Cawthon said of Golden Freddy, "I don't know what that meant."
Oh.
So, my kind of conclusion is that this wasn't supposed to be a grand narrative, but people wanted it to be, and they made it into one. They couldn't quite finish it, so more pieces get added. And as he, when I say he, I mean Scott Cawthon, is trying to maybe put this narrative in a direction that would have a cathartic ending, it keeps getting dragged in all sorts of different pieces.
I think he also likes the attention.
Oh yeah.
Like, he has...
He's made millions.
Yeah, he has, and he has a really fun time bantering with the community, and even someone, the people who host Game Theory have created lots of canon of kind of speculative shows about this on YouTube. And even Scott Cawthon on Steam, I think, once wrote a comment to one of the guys and was like, "Oh, these Game Theory people almost got it right." So,
Yeah.
yeah, he trolls people like that. Yeah, and yeah, what does that even mean? But it's also good to remember that he was kind of a failed game designer, and he was about to, like, this was going to be his last game, and he was going to quit forever. So I don't think he had, no offense to him, but the skill to create a coherent narrative, and he just thought, okay, let me do this thing, see if people notice it, and people fell in love with it, and he didn't expect that. And to kind of, I guess, loop into adaptation, a big part of what makes adaptation so successful is intertextuality, and being able to pull pieces of something and transpose them onto another. So even if we're thinking, all right, we have these children who were shoved into these animatronic suits and now possess the bodies of these suits, you kind of want to know about the children, like why were they chosen, who are they like, and then you have these RPGs where you're playing as these freaky animatronics that kill you, but now they're happy and it's fun, and you can kind of guess their personalities, and then, so it gives it, again, another layer of storytelling, but it pulls out pieces of that original one. So as opposed to para-narrative, which kind of is the underlying text, you have intertextuality, which pulls out pieces of text and messes it around. And I think that's why the adaptation is so successful, because even with the books, you're playing as a totally different character. Or read, oh my god, you're...
Yep.
I quit. No, you're... Like, it's a totally different person. You, like, who was never in the games, that you're playing as a young... Oh my god, you are reading the story of a young woman, Charlie, who is from this small town that has the Freddy Fazbears, and she and her friends have to, like, run away from the animatronics at night. Like, has nothing to do with the games. But you have that little... freaky animatronics coming out to kill people at night, and then you transpose that into another medium, and then it keeps going, and that's what makes the adaptation so successful, especially when parts of that feed into the paratext.
And,
So,
the character we've understood to be William Afton, who's probably the killer, was
Yes.
actually first introduced in the books.
yes.
And then they confirmed it by saying his name in Sister Location, which is not the fifth game.
The sixth.
Yeah, the fifth game is the RPG
Yeah.
that got taken down for being horrible. It's just actually a bad game. So Scott Cawthon took it down, refunded everybody who bought it, and put it up for free on Game Jolt, because these are the sorts of things he does. But in the game after that, another classic Scott Cawthon, he's like, no, there will never be a Five Nights at Freddy's 6. And there isn't. It's called Five Nights at Freddy's Sister Location. So yeah, there's no sixth game. There's just a game that is sixth in order. So he does that kind of thing. But they say William Afton's name for the first time in the intro scene of that, but the books had come out like 2 years earlier. So there are the crossings of these bits, and then Cawthon does things like saying, well, it's a story that could have been. So he,
Those forensic fandom people, like...
I know, they're the MVPs for real. Or MVP, sorry. But I think that's it's adaptable because it's just already so many little bits and pieces of interesting things. The books were, it had its own unique plot. It works super well as a VR game because these are things that are scary, and why not have it in VR? I haven't done the ARG stuff yet. I know that it'll be out pretty soon, I think. Didn't get to go to the when they actually made like a theme park element of it. The movie's been canceled twice.
Yes.
There's actually a somebody told me about this like 3 days ago. There's a copycat movie about animatronics killing people coming out. That's not Five Nights at Freddy's, because it's really adaptable. And I think it's just, you have some universal themes of things that are scary, things that are interesting.
Mystery.
You have mystery. Children are always an ethos bit. And also, like I said earlier, I don't think there's a single human on the face of the planet who doesn't think animatronics are, like, not scary. Like, everybody is. So, I think that's why it's so incredibly adaptable, is it just has some key components that really crosses, it crosses through boundaries that aren't medium specific.
Okay, I want to challenge you a bit here because you both have been doing too well. So let's talk now about the graphics and the mechanics of the game, which aren't necessarily in your wheelhouses, but like, you know, you can't deny, or you can't not notice. The game is done. So, talk about like what the game looks like and how the mechanics function, and maybe connect it back to like what your perspectives are and how you would study it. And I have a question as well to loop into this. This comes in from Rena, who I believe is sitting here. Despite the low coding and graphics fidelity of the FNAF original, it still gained popularity. I argue because good game design is more important than advanced programming. Do you agree with this statement? And if so, what game design elements do you think are particularly important to the popularity of this game franchise? So this is actually very interesting that Rena talks about the first game, because in that first game, as you said, we didn't have a lot of detail on the narrative itself. So there might have been, like, there must have been other reasons that hooked people. And can you attribute any of that to the game design?
I totally agree. Like, I don't think you need a good, like, visually appealing design to make a game fun. Like, we still play Super Mario Bros, right? Or Tetris and things like that. But in terms of what makes it maybe palatable and attractive to the user is kind of coming back to that basic lack of agency, and even just basic, like, you want to win, right? Like, you want to survive all 5 nights, and it is difficult, especially when you're using a mouse and it's very clunky to move over, and especially in the first game, like, you have to close a door, and then it's like you can run out of power, and then if you run out of power, Golden Freddy comes out and, like, eats you. So it's very difficult to even maneuver, and we know the gaming community. It's like you have those people who are like, I'm a completionist, I'm going to beat everything, I'm going to win, and it was frustrating when you didn't. And then people, it's a challenge now, right? It's like, why can't I beat this game? I'm going to beat this game, and I will beat this game. So I think in terms of just the clunkiness of it is kind of what helped fuel this kind of like wanting and needing to finish it, as well as kind of these small elements where when you start, especially when you play the game maybe the first few times, you might not notice like the flickering of the newspaper clipping and the changing, but then when you're staring at this game for like 3 weeks in a row because you really want to beat it, it's like, now I'm noticing other things because I'm used to that design, and that's when that kind of paranarrative structure comes in.
Okay, so I think there's a lot of things that contributed to its success, and to kind of dig into how this game came to be in the first place, I think that has a lot to do with it. So Coffin started his career as trying to make Christian scripture games. And yes, it is a thing to go from a Christian scripture game to the guy who made Five Nights at Freddy's. But he did it. He was not having a lot of success with those early games, and you can see a lot of the same mechanics that he uses in the Five Nights at Freddy's series were things that he was already using elsewhere, but it was definitely a case of the mechanics and the message not lining up clearly at all. At one point, and I think this was really the tipping point, before he made Five Nights at Freddy's 1, he made a game called Chipper and Sons.
Don't Google it.
You can Google Jim Sterling's take on it, because I think that's what started the series. Jim Sterling absolutely ripped this game apart. He said the characters looked eyeless and soulless and dead inside. They're probably robot beavers. There's no living being here. They'll eat your children. I'm not kidding. Like,
These are the actual comments.
yeah, these are actual things he said. So I mean, he just was like, the creatures in this game look dead. I'm expecting them to kill me at any time. Like, And they weren't really creepy models. I'm not gonna lie. Like, ugh. But I think it was like a spelling game, like, so like, it was supposed to be an educational one. So Coffin kind of doubles down and says, okay, you want scary? Watch this.
Clearly this guy.
And like you were saying, Pam, he was ready to quit. But then somebody saw this trailer for Five Nights at Freddy's somewhere, and it got hyped, and it went through the Steam green light, and Kickstarter wasn't quite the thing it is, but like it's basically that equivalent of crowd hype and crowd formation to create this thing. There's no way it took a lot of funding to make that game, though. So you have this excited crowd, and then it comes out, and it's really scary. Then it hits YouTube, and you have people like you have people doing Let's Plays, and you have really popular YouTubers that I won't name names of right now, playing it and saying, oh, this is so hard and this is so scary, but also finding it really funny. Like, they're reacting funny when they're playing it. They're overreacting, they're screeching, they're falling out of their chair. But also, there are kind of weird, funny quirks about it. The series itself has this kind of weird, like, really dark sense of humor. Yeah. For example, I won't get into that example, but so seeing like your favorite YouTubers play these games and they're like, it's so hard, it's so scary, and then Coffin comes out after the game is gaining popularity and says, I don't know if it's possible to beat it on its hardest mode because I couldn't do it. So of course YouTube took that up as a challenge. This increases gameplay and visibility of this more and more. First YouTube user to actually beat it was, his name is Big Bug, I believe, or Bear Bug possibly? Some sort of bug and bear. And maybe big. And he said it took him 23 hours straight to do it. So then Coffin was like, wow, on YouTube. So this challenge was there and very present. So like, are you a good enough gamer to do the scary thing and do this really hard thing that took somebody 23 hours straight? That challenge is definitely a part of why it got big, I think. And the design in this case matched what you were doing. Like having these scary beaver robots in a spelling game doesn't make as much sense as having scary animatronics trying to kill you and then they scream in your face. Like, so I think it's having the right mechanics, fit the right setting, having that design being thrown at you in a way that actually connects the things you're doing to what the game is. Brenda Romero says the mechanics are the message, and I think this is an instance where those line up very nicely.
And I think another thing is lived experience, almost. Like,
Yeah.
When you're playing the game, you have all these people kind of rage quitting it and frustrated with it, but also when we look at horror, and kind of when you, again, this is my Slavic hat back on, you have kind of nations, I guess, that are going through lots of traumatic things at a time. People are looking for not just individual experience, but a lived and shared experience. So with this game, you're having people who, Betsy played the game, then I played the game, and we both have that individual frightening experience, and then we discuss it and see how can we overcome that together, or what are kind of shared points of it. And again, now when we have the challenge aspect, especially, I think there was, what was it, a few years ago, YouTube playthroughs were really popular in terms of horror. Like, it wasn't just any playthroughs, it was specifically horror game playthroughs. So even Amnesia Dark Descent, that was how it became huge, right? It was because of all the YouTubers playing it and being like, oh my god, this is so scary, you need to experience this with me. And you have people sharing their experiences and kind of connecting because of fear and seeing how they can overcome that together, and that's really huge as well.
Thank you both. I looked at the time, and we are already at an hour, somehow. So
sorry, y'all.
Let's take some questions from the audience. We won't have unlimited time for questions from the audience, but I want to hear what everybody out there has to say. And Grace, who's sitting at the front, has a microphone so that the camera will be able to hear your lovely voices. So does anybody have a question they would like to start this with?
Well, I get a little closer. Is there some point in Five Nights at Freddy's, because of the nature of the challenge and it taking a long time and you being a gamer to get to some point where you're sort of beating the game, that it's not scary anymore? Like, did you notice in your YouTube watching that was, yeah? Okay.
I think with everything, you become desensitized eventually. And I think kind of part of that desensitization is when the paratext kind of starts to come through, because that's when you can focus on other things instead of, oh my God, it's crawling through the fence, right? Which was me for like the first week of playing this. So I definitely think that's an important part of discovering the narrative. Is just not being afraid and just being mad enough to continue playing it. And then
yeah, you can definitely get used to it. I actually got to the point through studying it that like I would have Let's Plays of it on and the game playing and I'd fall asleep. Like the noises don't even like, when you're playing it, it's like I said, it still gets me sometimes, but not nearly as often, especially like in the first game, there's a very specific pattern that all of the animatronics take. So you know, like there's a way to play it where you basically never have to encounter anything scary. It's very boring though. It's an incredibly boring game when you're on like a 15-minute repeat or 15-second time loop for 8-minute rounds. But yeah, that's what you have to do to beat it on its hardest difficulty, and that's why like it's boring when it gets to that point, honestly, the first one. Once the scary goes away in that one, and once you're finding all of these paratextual clues, and you're like, all right, well, I guess that's weird. Once the scare wears off, yeah, you're not getting that affective jolt that you used to be getting. It's not engaging with you the same way. So Cawthon was really smart to drop Five Nights at Freddy's 2, like 6 months after the first game, because it added new scary things and added new mechanics that made it more complicated, added more randomization to it. Yeah, oh God. Plus, you went from having like 4 or 5 creatures to watch to, I think there's 11 to 13 in the second game. So, yeah, the scares do wear off, and it can lay bare some kind of dull mechanics. And, like, the art style is pretty straightforward, too. Like, there's not a lot of animation in it. You never see the animatronics move. When you're looking at them through the cameras, they're just staring at you, you know? So it definitely loses its scare, and honestly, I think most of what scares it about me now is the noise, which sometimes I can fall asleep to. But like yesterday when we were playing, we were talking to somebody who was watching us stream it, and I was not paying attention to the game very well, and I lost, and we all went flying backwards.
Which is still on our Instagram account if you want.
So yeah, it can be significantly less scary. It's always going to be kind of scary when you're playing it and really concentrating on listening, though. The sounds are just creepy, and the kind of anticipation of something bad happening or possibly happening is, yeah, unpleasant. So, thank you, Alex.
Hi. So I guess my question is, like, obviously the terrifyingness, for lack of a better term, of the narrative comes through like the environmental storytelling. That's what we've been talking about. So is there any particular game mechanic or piece of the environment that A, communicates the narrative the best, or B, is the most terrifying when it's communicating the narrative?
I want to say the music box.
I was going to say the puppet, yeah.
There's in the second game, there is a puppet. Spirit ghost thing, which you never see, and there's a mechanic in essentially you have to go through the motion of pulling up your camera system, going to a specific room, and winding a music box. And whenever the sound goes out, the marionette comes and kills you, regardless. There's no stopping it. So if you're not listening or you forget to wind it, right, like you die. So that's probably the worst mechanic to remember it. And
yeah, and it also turns out that character is one of the most important in the series, and you get to know that through these little paratextual bits. For example, the Give Gifts, Give Life minigame, you play that exact same puppet, and you try to give like wrapped up presents to these little kids, but they're dead. I should specify when there are depictions of dead children. This is in the like 2-bit Atari thing, so they're just little gray blobs, and if you didn't know what they were trying to represent, you wouldn't understand that they were that. It's not graphic. It's not graphic. So after the puppet, you controlling the puppet, give these 4 kids presents, and they don't react.
it changes the directions to give life, and then he puts the animatronic heads on all 4 of them. So the implication is that this puppet is the one who actually is moving or allowing these souls, is what they call them in the game, to possess these animatronic bodies and ultimately take revenge on the adults who failed to listen and protect them.
Yes.
That puppet, oh.
So this game isn't the first to have paranarrative. There are big examples like Dark Souls or Hello Neighbor that have released their story in like big chunks, but this is probably one of the biggest examples where the paranarrative has been developing alongside the forensic fandom that has been picking it apart and ripping it to shreds on the internet. How do you see the forensic fandom manipulating the storyline or the paranarrative as it develops in these segments?
I'll let Betsy answer the most part of it, but I think kind of with Scott Coffin is people actually figuring it out. I think he has a bit of an ego, and that he thinks like people don't know it. So back to that example with game theory, where they essentially figured out the entire narrative, and Scott was like 98% right. Like, what is 98%? And then to say, oh no, it doesn't mean anything, and then to do it. So I feel like the fandom was getting stuff and understanding it, and then he was like, no, I don't want that. I want the mystery to remain, and would continue to change it. And I don't think Scott Coffin will ever come out and be like, this was the narrative. He's never going to do that, because it's too much fun for him to troll his fans online, essentially. So.
I do agree that like part of keeping this fandom working and functioning is this mystery. The 4th game is a very interesting reaction to things being figured out for the most part. At the end of the game, if you beat it on all the difficulties, you are shown a briefcase with 2 locks on it, and you can like shake it around and try to open it, but nothing happens. And the screen will go black, and it says some things are better left unknown.
Thanks, Scott.
I've also seen Scott in interviews and things say that he was afraid that people wouldn't accept the story he was trying to tell. He didn't think that the forensic fandom, my words, not his, were going to accept as canon what he was kind of placing, which was this dream theory. Like, when he was trying to tease that it might be all this kid's coma, all of the games were just this kid's coma, people were like, oh, that's cheap, that's stupid, I don't like that, that's not interesting. And he just responded, well, why doesn't Toy Chica have a beak in the 2nd game? Yeah. And then in another game, there's a little toy of Chica without a beak, and that's the 4th one, and that's the one with this kid who's returning to their bedroom and having these things haunt him in his dreams, right? Dreams, maybe, and then, like I said, there's the IV stand that will pick up next to the bed sometimes. So there's a heavy implication that the story has definitely been influenced by the presence of this fandom that seemed to want it to go a particular way. And when Scott was like, oh, this way, they were like, So there's an argument that there was supposed to be something in the box, and he took it out because he didn't think that fans would like it.
And I think Scott also realizes, like, again, to what Betsy was saying earlier about Kickstarter kind of esque, he realizes the power that his fans have in making this game and fun and making it as popular as it is. So keeping it purposefully vague or giving fans what they want and then taking away certain aspects to keep the mystery going is definitely, I think, a calculated move on his part, just to keep the hype up and to make these games as popular as they are. Like, you can even, at this point, you could buy you can become Foxy or Freddy Fazbear for Halloween if you go to Spirit Halloween. You can buy the costumes there. You can go to like EB Games, and they even have like the little like plush toys and whatnots and like pin up heads of all of them, right? So.
And I think he did try to kind of control the way the narrative was shaking out, basically, by those books. And then when people were like, the books are dumb, he was like, maybe they don't. And then he just like doubled down and said, yes, they are. And in Pizzeria Simulator, you have an attempted end to one story, and then the VR game kind of starts a new line of reasoning outside of that kind of arc. So like there's an attempt at cathartic resolution,
Yes.
But it also opened up a lot more questions too. So I think I don't remember exactly what he said, but sometimes he said something to the effect of sometimes a story becomes so full it can't say anything. So I think he just kind of was like, we're going to set that down, and now we're going to talk about glitch rabbits. And that's what the VR game is about.
Is there anybody else who has a burning question? Okay. Well, I do. And this actually will be the question with which we close the panel. So initially, I was going to close the panel by asking you to name, each of you, the one thing that you think is the scariest part of this. But I feel like those answers have already emerged. You know, Betsy talked about sound. Pam talked about lack of agency. So instead, I'm going to ask you to spend no more than, let's say, 30 seconds each. Yeah, challenge. And if you could research anything, or if you would like to see research on anything that you haven't already looked at about Five Nights at Freddy's, any one of the games or the adaptations, what would it be? And feel free to cross disciplines and not just stick with what you have already been working on or thinking about. Looks like, should we start with Betsy?
Okay. As far as I know, I think I might be, and this is a weird thing to say, I think I might be the only person who's published on this in game studies, because it's not really one of the greats, you know? So anybody, I would like to see anybody researching it and talking about it in an academic and intelligent way, because usually what you hear is people going like, that stupid game with the jump scares and this whole fan community is full of weird children, and, you know, like... So just anybody kind of taking it seriously. It's probably the second most successful indie franchise ever. I think Minecraft is bigger, probably. But so just any attention to it, I think would be pretty cool.
I would love to see environmental storytelling, kind of maybe a little bit more separated from the paratext, just because you literally cannot figure out the story unless you interact with the environment and you're very aware of certain things changing in your environment. And I think especially now, like, the VR version has come out, and that is so scary. And then the AR version is coming out. So if you want animatronics popping up in your bedroom at night, that is the game for you. So I would love to see, kind of backtracking to Rena's question about what kinds of mechanics. Well, now we have the game jumping from just a simple, like, mouse game on a computer to VR and AR, and how does that kind of change the level of immersion, or more kind of NSERC-y studies on this game would be cool.
Well, thank you both, and thank you everybody for listening to us and asking those questions. This made the panel that much better. And thank you again to our awesome panelists.